The moment people start laughing at a man's work is often the moment they stop looking closely. The Dallas Auto Innovation Expo filled nearly 200,000 square feet of convention space with polished concept cars, advanced prototypes, and technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Investors moved between exhibits. Journalists carried cameras through crowded aisles. Engineers gathered around displays while executives exchanged business cards beneath enormous digital screens. At the center of all that attention stood Victoria Grant, the celebrated Chief Executive Officer of Grant Automotive Technologies. At 36 years old, she had built a reputation for spotting valuable innovation before anyone else. People listened when she spoke. Markets reacted when she invested. Companies changed direction when she expressed interest. That morning, dozens of reporters followed her through the exhibition hall as she evaluated new technology from around the country. Most exhibitors prepared carefully for the chance to impress her. Ethan Carter did not. At the far edge of the convention floor, away from the luxury displays and expensive marketing campaigns, a single engine rested on a simple metal stand. No bright banners surrounded it. No promotional videos played nearby. There was only a small information card and a quiet man standing beside it. Ethan wore a faded work jacket, dark jeans, and boots that looked like they had seen years of hard labor. Beside him sat his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, drawing in a notebook while occasionally glancing at the engine with pride. The exhibit attracted little attention. Most visitors walked past without slowing down. A few looked briefly before continuing toward the larger displays. Ethan seemed completely unbothered. He simply stood beside the machine he had spent years building with his own hands. When Victoria's group eventually reached the display, several journalists stopped to photograph the unusual engine. It looked different from anything else in the hall. The design appeared simple at first glance, yet there was something unusual about the precision of its construction. Victoria studied it for several seconds. Then she looked at the information card. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Hand-built?" she asked. One of her engineers nodded. "Apparently." Another engineer stepped closer. "No corporate backing. No manufacturing partner. No patent portfolio listed." Victoria looked toward Ethan. "You built this yourself?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The engineer beside Victoria smiled. "That is ambitious." Another laughed softly. "Very ambitious." Victoria glanced back at the engine. Innovation is difficult enough with a full research team. Her tone remained professional, but the amusement was obvious. Several people nearby chuckled. "And you are presenting this against companies spending hundreds of millions of dollars?" More laughter followed. Ethan remained calm. Lily looked up from her notebook. Her small hands tightened around the pencil for a moment. Victoria shook her head with a polite smile. "I admire confidence." The surrounding crowd smiled with her. Then she turned to leave. Reporters followed. Engineers followed. Investors followed. Within seconds, the crowd moved on. The laughter faded into the noise of the convention hall. Ethan simply looked at the engine. Lily stared after the departing group. "Dad?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled. "Yes?" She glanced at the machine. Then toward the crowd that had ignored it. They did not really look at it. Ethan's smile never changed. "No," he said calmly. "Not yet." The convention hall grew louder as the afternoon crowd arrived. New visitors flooded the aisles. Investors gathered around advanced battery systems. Journalists chased executives between presentations. Startup founders competed for attention beneath giant screens filled with promises about the future. Yet at the far edge of the exhibition floor, very little changed. Ethan Carter remained beside his engine. Lily sat nearby with her notebook resting on her knees. Every few minutes, someone would slow down, glance at the machine, and continue walking. Neither of them seemed surprised. Lily eventually looked up from her drawing. "Does it bother you?" Ethan turned toward her. "What?" "The laughing." Ethan thought about the question for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Not really." "Why not?" He looked across the crowded convention center. "Because people usually laugh at things they do not understand." Lily considered that answer carefully. She seemed satisfied. A few minutes later, 2 engineering students stopped at the display. Unlike most visitors, they did not immediately leave. One circled the engine slowly. The other studied several exposed components. "This is different," the first student said quietly. Ethan nodded. "It is." "Who designed it?" "I did." The students exchanged glances. One pointed toward a section near the center assembly. "Why did you do that?" Ethan looked at the area. A small smile appeared. "You noticed." The student nodded. "Nobody builds it that way. Most people do not." The second student leaned closer. "What does it do?" Ethan folded his arms. "It solves a problem." The students waited for more. None came. Eventually they laughed. Not because they were mocking him. Because they realized he was not going to explain. Before leaving, both took photographs. Lily watched them disappear into the crowd. They saw something. Ethan nodded. "Maybe." Across the convention center, Victoria Grant continued her tour of the exhibition. Cameras followed her from one presentation to another. She listened to pitches. Examined prototypes. Asked difficult questions. Most companies hoped for her approval. Yet despite all the technology surrounding her, something about the simple engine remained in the back of her mind. Not because she thought it was valuable. Because she could not understand why its creator seemed completely unconcerned by failure. Most inventors desperately sought validation. Ethan had not even attempted to defend himself. Back at the display, the afternoon passed quietly. Then something unexpected happened. A gray-haired engineer wearing a visitor badge stopped in front of the engine and remained there for nearly 10 minutes. He never spoke. He simply observed. Eventually he crouched slightly to examine one specific section. His expression changed. He stood up. Looked again. Then looked at Ethan. "Did you build every part yourself?" Ethan nodded. "Almost all of them." The engineer stared at the machine a little longer. "Interesting." That was all he said. Then he walked away. Lily immediately looked toward her father. He saw something too. Ethan watched the engineer disappear into the crowd. Maybe. But this time his answer sounded different. Because he had noticed something as well. For the first time all day, someone with genuine experience had stopped laughing and started looking. By late afternoon, the atmosphere around the small display began to change in ways that were almost impossible to measure. The crowds were still flowing toward larger exhibits. Investors were still gathering around famous brands. Reporters were still chasing executives. Yet every so often, another visitor stopped in front of Ethan Carter's engine and stayed longer than expected. None of them announced what they were seeing. Most simply stared, studied a detail, then walked away deep in thought. Lily noticed it before anyone else. More people are stopping now. Ethan glanced toward a pair of engineers examining the engine from different angles. A few. Why? Ethan looked at the machine for a moment. Because curiosity is stronger than confidence. Lily tilted her head. What does that mean? People are most confident before they notice something they cannot explain. Nearby, one of the engineers suddenly crouched beside the display. His colleague joined him. The two exchanged confused looks. One pointed toward a component hidden deep within the structure. The other shook his head. Then both began examining the same area more carefully. Neither laughed. Across the convention hall, Victoria Grant had nearly completed her scheduled appearances. She had reviewed dozens of presentations and listened to countless pitches. Most blended together. Different companies. Different promises. Similar ideas. As she prepared to leave for an executive reception, one of her senior engineers approached. "Do you have a minute?" Victoria looked up from her tablet. "What is it?" The engineer hesitated. "That engine." Victoria sighed slightly. "The hand-built one?" "Yes." "What about it?" The engineer folded his arms. "I think you should take another look." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The engineer searched for an answer. After several seconds he shook his head. "That is the problem. I am not sure." Victoria studied him carefully. He was not someone who became easily impressed. "You cannot explain it?" "Not yet." That response captured her attention more than she expected. Back at the exhibit, a small group had formed around the display. No advertisements had changed. No demonstrations had been scheduled. Yet something about the engine continued pulling people back. One visitor photographed a section of the assembly. Another opened a notebook and began making sketches. A third simply stood there in silence. Ethan remained exactly as he had been all day. Calm. Patient. Uninterested in selling himself. Lily watched the growing crowd with a smile. "They are looking now." Ethan nodded. "Yes. You were right." Before he could answer, a familiar voice interrupted. "Perhaps." The crowd shifted slightly. Victoria Grant had returned. Several engineers followed behind her. So did a handful of reporters who immediately sensed something unusual. Victoria stepped closer to the engine than she had during her first visit. This time she did not smile. She did not joke. She simply examined the machine in silence. Seconds stretched into nearly a minute. The surrounding crowd grew quiet. Finally Victoria looked toward Ethan. "I have spent most of the afternoon listening to experts argue about your engine." Ethan said nothing. The strange part is that nobody agrees on why they are arguing. A few engineers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria looked back at the machine. That usually means someone has overlooked something important. For the first time all day, genuine curiosity had replaced amusement. And Ethan noticed it immediately. The small crowd surrounding the display continued growing throughout the afternoon. What had started as a forgotten corner of the convention hall now felt strangely different. People still passed by on their way to larger exhibits, but more of them slowed down. More of them stopped. More of them stared. Victoria Grant remained beside the engine longer than anyone expected. Several engineers stood nearby studying individual components. Nobody seemed interested in leaving. Ethan Carter simply watched. He did not explain. He did not promote. He did not attempt to influence their conclusions. Lily sat quietly beside the display, observing the reactions with growing satisfaction. One of Victoria's senior engineers suddenly pointed toward a section deep within the assembly. "There." Another engineer immediately stepped closer. "That cannot be right." "That is what I thought." A third engineer joined them. Within seconds, all three were discussing the same component. Their voices remained low, but their expressions revealed growing confusion. Victoria noticed. "What did you find?" The first engineer hesitated. "We are not completely sure." Victoria folded her arms. Try. The engineer looked back at the engine. If this part is doing what I think it is doing, then several conventional assumptions would no longer apply. Another engineer immediately disagreed. That would be impossible. Would it? The first engineer pointed again. Silence followed. Victoria turned toward Ethan. Did you intentionally design it that way? Ethan looked at the component. Yes. Why? Because the traditional solution creates a different problem. Several engineers exchanged looks. One shook his head. That answer raises more questions than it solves. Ethan smiled slightly. Usually. The surrounding crowd laughed softly. This time nobody was laughing at him. A few reporters who had returned with Victoria began taking notes. One investor moved closer. Another joined him. Neither seemed interested in the larger displays anymore. Across the hall, word slowly began spreading among industry professionals. A strange engine at the edge of the convention center was generating increasingly uncomfortable conversations among experienced engineers. Curiosity attracted more curiosity. Soon several additional specialists arrived. Some worked for manufacturers. Others represented research firms. One after another they examined the machine. The pattern repeated every time. Initial confidence. Careful observation. Growing uncertainty. Then silence. Lily eventually leaned toward her father. Nobody is laughing now. Ethan looked around the crowd. No. What changed? He watched a group of engineers debating quietly near the display. They started looking. Nearby, Victoria listened as two specialists argued over competing theories. Neither could fully explain what they were seeing. Yet both agreed on one thing. The engine deserved far more attention than they originally believed. Victoria looked toward Ethan again. Earlier that morning she had dismissed the display within seconds. Now she found herself studying every detail. The confidence she normally relied upon was beginning to shift into something else. Respect. Not complete respect. Not yet. But enough to make her reconsider her first impression. Then another engineer arrived carrying a tablet. He approached Victoria immediately. You need to see this. She accepted the device. What is it? We compared several design elements against existing patent databases. Victoria looked down. Her expression changed almost instantly. Are these results accurate? We checked twice. For the first time all afternoon, genuine surprise appeared on her face. Around her, the engineers noticed. So did Ethan. And somewhere inside the growing crowd, the first whispers about the engine's possible value quietly began to spread. The whispers spread faster than anyone expected. What began as a quiet discussion among a handful of engineers was now moving through the convention center like an invisible current. Small groups gathered near the display. Specialists returned carrying colleagues. Investors who had ignored the engine earlier suddenly found reasons to walk past it again. Nobody seemed completely certain what they were looking at. Yet more and more people were becoming convinced that they should not ignore it. Victoria Grant continued studying the tablet handed to her by the engineer. She reviewed the data once. Then a second time. Finally she looked up. You are telling me these design elements do not match any existing commercial architecture? The engineer nodded. Not completely. Another engineer joined the conversation. Several concepts resemble existing systems, but the way they have been combined is unlike anything we found. Victoria looked toward the engine. The confidence from earlier in the day was fading. In its place was something much more uncomfortable. Uncertainty. Nearby, reporters noticed the shift immediately. Cameras began focusing less on the surrounding exhibits and more on the growing crowd around Ethan Carter's display. One journalist approached an engineer. "What makes this engine special?" The engineer hesitated. "That is exactly what we are trying to determine." Back at the display, Ethan remained calm. Lily watched the increasing attention with wide eyes. "Dad." "Yes?" "Why are there so many people now?" Ethan looked around the crowd. "People pay attention when experts become confused." Lily smiled. "That sounds funny." "Sometimes it is." A few feet away, two industry analysts were comparing notes. One pointed toward several design features while the other shook his head repeatedly. "If this performs the way I think it does, the efficiency numbers would be remarkable." His colleague frowned. "That would require solving problems manufacturers have struggled with for years." Exactly. Neither seemed comfortable with that possibility. Across the convention floor, more investors began arriving. Some represented automotive firms. Others specialized in emerging technology. Most had heard only fragments of information. A strange hand-built engine. Engineers arguing. Patent databases producing unexpected results. Nobody wanted to be the person who overlooked something valuable. Victoria eventually stepped closer to Ethan. This time there was no amusement in her expression. "How long did it take you?" Ethan looked at the engine. "Several years." "Working alone?" "Mostly." Victoria glanced toward Lily. The young girl sat proudly beside the display, completely unconcerned by the growing crowd. "And she was there through all of it?" Ethan nodded. "Every step." Lily smiled without looking up from her notebook. Victoria remained silent for a moment. Then she turned back toward the machine. For the first time all day, she was not evaluating an invention. She was evaluating the man who had built it. Nearby, another engineer suddenly hurried toward the group carrying fresh data. His expression alone drew attention. "We finished the preliminary modeling." Several heads turned immediately. Victoria accepted the report. The engineer lowered his voice. "You should see these numbers." She scanned the page. Her eyes narrowed. Then widened slightly. Around her, the surrounding experts immediately noticed the reaction. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Because whatever Victoria Grant had just seen was important enough to make one of the most respected executives in the industry completely forget about every other exhibit in the building. The crowd surrounding the display had become one of the busiest locations in the entire convention center. What started as quiet curiosity was turning into something much larger. Engineers continued arriving. Investors stood shoulder to shoulder studying the engine. Reporters adjusted cameras to capture every reaction. Yet the center of attention remained unchanged. Ethan Carter stood calmly beside the machine while Lily sat nearby with her notebook. Neither appeared overwhelmed by the growing attention. Victoria Grant continued reviewing the report in her hands. The preliminary modeling results had clearly affected her. Several engineers waited nearby, hoping she would say something. Finally she looked up. "Run it again." One engineer blinked. "We already verified the numbers." "Run it again." Minutes later, additional specialists repeated the calculations using independent models. The process attracted even more attention. People began asking questions. Why were senior engineers suddenly rechecking the same data? Why had one of the industry's most respected chief executive officers spent nearly an hour at a display she originally dismissed? The answers remained unclear. That uncertainty only increased the interest. Lily watched the activity with fascination. "They keep checking the same thing." Ethan nodded. Sometimes people trust their assumptions more than their eyes. Across the display area, the engineering team finished their second review. The results matched the first. Then a third review produced the same outcome. A quiet tension settled over the group. Victoria accepted the updated findings. This time she remained silent longer. One of the investors finally spoke. "Are the numbers real?" Nobody answered immediately. Eventually one engineer cleared his throat. "If the design performs according to the model, the efficiency improvements would be significant." "How significant?" The engineer hesitated. "Enough to change several conversations happening in this industry." The surrounding crowd immediately grew quieter. Investors exchanged glances. Reporters began recording again. Victoria looked toward Ethan. "Did you know this would happen?" Ethan glanced at the engine. "I knew what I built." "And you never tried to market it?" "No." "Why not?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Because I wanted it to work before I wanted people to notice it." Several engineers looked away after hearing that answer. The statement carried more weight than they expected. Throughout the day, dozens of companies had promoted unfinished concepts supported by expensive presentations. Yet the man standing beside the simplest display in the building had spent years working quietly before asking anyone to look. Nearby, another specialist arrived carrying fresh analysis. He approached Victoria immediately. "We found something else." Her eyes narrowed. "What?" The engineer lowered his voice. "The architecture may support applications beyond what we originally assumed." Victoria stared at him. "You are certain?" "Not yet." "But?" The engineer looked toward the engine. "The possibilities are larger than we thought." That statement spread through the crowd almost instantly. Investors who had been cautiously interested suddenly became attentive. A reporter stepped away to make a phone call. Another began sending messages. Information was moving beyond the convention center now. Ethan noticed the change immediately. So did Victoria. For the first time that day, both understood the same thing. The conversation was no longer about whether the engine mattered. The conversation had become how much it might actually be worth. The atmosphere inside the convention center changed completely during the next hour. The engine was no longer an overlooked exhibit, sitting quietly at the edge of the floor. It had become the center of every serious conversation happening in the building. Investors who had spent the morning discussing electric platforms and autonomous systems were now gathering around Ethan Carter's display. Reporters who had planned to cover major corporate announcements redirected their attention. Engineers continued arriving in waves. Each seemed convinced they would finally identify the secret everyone else had missed. None left with simple answers. Lily watched the growing crowd with amazement. "Dad, there are more people here than at the big displays." Ethan glanced around. "Looks that way." "Are you surprised?" He smiled slightly. "Not really." Nearby, Victoria Grant was speaking with a group of investors when another executive approached. He represented one of the largest performance engineering firms in North America. Unlike many visitors, he did not waste time pretending indifference. He walked directly to Ethan. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." The executive extended a hand. "Daniel Brooks." "Brooks Advanced Mobility." Ethan shook it. Daniel looked toward the engine. "I would like to discuss acquiring this technology." The surrounding crowd immediately grew quieter. Several investors turned toward the conversation. Reporters raised cameras. Ethan remained calm. "You have not even seen a full demonstration." Daniel smiled. "I have seen enough to know I should not wait." Before Ethan could answer, another voice interrupted. "Then you are already late." A second executive stepped forward from the opposite side of the crowd. This one represented a multinational automotive group. Several engineers exchanged surprised looks. Victoria noticed the tension immediately. The second executive looked directly at Ethan. Our company would also like to discuss an acquisition. The first executive folded his arms. We were speaking. Now we all are. More investors began moving closer. Lily looked up at her father. I think they all want your engine. Ethan smiled. Maybe. Victoria almost laughed when she heard the familiar answer. The situation became even more unusual when a third company representative joined the conversation. Then a fourth. Within minutes, serious business discussions were happening in every direction. Figures were whispered. Possibilities were discussed. Market projections appeared on tablets. One investor quietly mentioned $8 million. Another immediately suggested a higher number. The reporters exchanged stunned looks. Nobody had expected the forgotten exhibit from the morning to become the most valuable attraction at the event. Victoria stepped closer to Ethan. Her expression was very different from the one she wore earlier that day. I owe you an apology. Ethan looked at her. For what? For making a judgment before I understood what I was looking at. Ethan considered her words. Then he nodded once. That happens. The simplicity of the response seemed to surprise her. There was no bitterness. No desire to embarrass her. Only quiet honesty. Before she could reply, another investor arrived carrying a formal proposal. Then another. The numbers continued climbing. Around them, the crowd could feel something remarkable beginning to unfold. The question was no longer whether Ethan's hand-built engine had value. The question had become how high the offers would go before the day was over. The offers started quietly. A few investors approached Ethan Carter with professional smiles and carefully prepared proposals. Each believed they could secure an agreement before their competitors fully understood what was happening. That illusion lasted less than 15 minutes. By early evening, the entire atmosphere around the display had transformed into something nobody at the convention had expected. The forgotten exhibit at the edge of the hall had become the center of the most important conversation in the building. Representatives from major automotive firms stood beside venture capital groups. Technology executives reviewed reports while lawyers exchanged contact information. Reporters crowded around the growing circle of interested buyers. Everywhere Ethan looked, people were discussing possibilities, projections, and future applications. Yet he remained exactly the same. Calm. Patient. Unimpressed by the attention. Lily sat beside him, occasionally looking from one executive to another as if she were watching a very unusual sporting event. Dad. Yes? Are they competing? Ethan glanced at the crowd. Looks that way. For your engine? Maybe. Lily smiled. That means yes. Nearby, Victoria Grant listened as multiple firms compared evaluations. What surprised her most was not the growing interest. It was how quickly the numbers were rising. Earlier that afternoon, several experts had questioned whether the engine deserved attention at all. Now experienced investors were arguing over who would gain access first. One representative stepped forward with a formal proposal. $12 million. Several people turned immediately. Another executive shook his head. 15. A few reporters nearly dropped their notebooks. Victoria watched the reaction spreading through the crowd. The numbers continued climbing. 18 million. 22 million. 27 million. Each offer attracted new attention. More executives arrived. More analysts appeared. Nobody wanted to miss an opportunity that competitors were suddenly treating as transformative. Ethan listened politely to every proposal. He accepted documents. He answered questions. Yet he never appeared eager. That calmness made the investors even more nervous. One executive finally asked, "Are you planning to sell?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I am planning to listen." The answer only intensified the competition. Victoria almost smiled. Across the convention hall, people who had ignored the display earlier were now struggling to understand how everything had changed so quickly. The answer was simple. The value had always been there. Only the attention had changed. Another offer arrived. Then another. $30 million. $34 million. $38 million. Each new number generated fresh conversations. Lily looked toward her father. That seems like a lot. Ethan nodded. It is. How much is enough? Ethan smiled slightly. That is usually the wrong question. Before Lily could ask what the right question was, another executive stepped into the circle. This one represented an international consortium, known for acquiring breakthrough technologies. He spoke quietly with his team before approaching Ethan. The crowd sensed something important immediately. Cameras turned. Conversation stopped. Even Victoria focused completely on the exchange. The executive handed Ethan a document. Ethan glanced at it briefly. His expression did not change. Around him, several investors looked uneasy. One of them finally asked, "What is the offer?" Nobody answered. Then Victoria saw the number herself. For the first time that entire day, she looked genuinely stunned. Because the competition had just crossed a threshold that nobody in the building had imagined possible only a few hours earlier. The executive finally broke the silence. $50 million. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The noise of the convention center seemed to disappear beneath the weight of a single number. Reporters stared at one another. Investors looked down at their notes as if they had heard incorrectly. Several engineers simply stood frozen beside the display. Earlier that morning, many of those same people had walked past the engine without a second glance. Some had laughed. Some had dismissed it. Now one of the largest technology consortiums in the world was placing a $50 million valuation on the machine sitting quietly on a simple metal stand. Victoria Grant looked from the proposal to Ethan Carter. She remembered the first conversation they had shared that morning. She remembered the amusement in her own voice. Most of all, she remembered how calmly he had accepted it. Ethan reviewed the document for a few seconds before handing it back. The crowd waited. Cameras pointed toward him. Investors leaned forward. One reporter quietly whispered, "What is he going to do?" Ethan looked at the executive. "I appreciate the offer." The executive nodded. "Then we can begin discussions?" Ethan smiled politely. "We can begin a conversation." The answer triggered another wave of activity. Several competing firms immediately stepped forward. New proposals appeared. Revised numbers were discussed. Advisors exchanged cards. Lawyers requested meetings. Yet Ethan never rushed. He never celebrated. He never acted like a man standing in the middle of a life-changing moment. Lily watched everything with quiet curiosity. Finally she tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Dad?" Ethan looked down. "Yes? Are they still talking about the engine?" He smiled. "I think so." Lily considered the crowd for a moment. This morning they laughed. Ethan nodded. Some of them did. Why? Ethan looked around the convention hall. The same people who had ignored the display were now studying it with admiration. The same executives who had dismissed him were now asking for meetings. The same experts who had doubted the engine were now defending its importance. He thought about all of it before answering. Because sometimes people need time to see what is already there. Lily smiled. "I liked it the first time." Ethan laughed softly. "I know." A short distance away, Victoria approached them one final time. Her expression was sincere. Mr. Carter. Ethan turned toward her. Yes? I hope you know something. He waited. Victoria glanced at the engine. Then at the crowd surrounding it. The most impressive thing here was never the machine. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Victoria smiled. It was the man who spent years building it when nobody was paying attention. For the first time all day, Ethan looked genuinely caught off guard. Then he nodded once. Thank you. Minutes later, as the convention center lights began dimming for the evening, Ethan packed his notes while Lily gathered her drawings. Around them, executives continued discussing proposals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Yet father and daughter simply walked toward the exit together. No victory speech. No public celebration. No revenge. Behind them stood a crowd that had finally recognized value. Ahead of them waited a quiet evening. Lily slipped her hand into her father's as they walked. And for Ethan Carter, that mattered far more than any number written on a contract.